I hope you're doing okay. Today I'm bringing you an update to my new Commonplace book. But first, let me explain to you what's a Commonplace book if you've never watched a video of mine or a Commonplace video. A Commonplace book is rather an ancient idea. The first page in my first Commonplace book was a history of that concept because I could not wrap my mind around it. And basically, it's meant different things to different people, but the thing we can agree on is that it's a common place when you put different things. People put quotes they like, thoughts they have about articles, reviews of movies. I remember reading a classic and the lady was explaining that she was putting a recipe in her Commonplace book. It's basically your own personal encyclopedia, and what I like to put in my own Commonplace book is history, definitions of words, current events, biography of people, etc. When I started that session, I had borrowed a new issue of National Geographic at the library, and there was a section about Mayan history, and I got very interested while reading the article, and I decided to write a few pages about it. I'll explain to you why I'm interested in Mayan history in a bit, but first I wanted to tell you how I make my pages when I'm using an article as a source. When I'm working on an article, I read it first. I sometimes have a pencil with me and I underline or circle stuff I find interesting. And then when I'm doing my page, I basically have to reread lightly the article to remember what I found interesting, what is the context of some of the stuff I've underlined, and then I might look for additional information because sometimes they're very specialized articles and I don't understand some words of vocabulary that are not explained in it. That was the case for Mayan history because the word Mesoamerica was used a lot and I wasn't sure I understood what it was conveying, and basically, it's a historical and cultural region, and when I was looking for the definition of Mesoamerica, it made me want to make a whole page about what is Mesoamerica, who decided to call it that way, what it encompasses for historians, so I stopped myself short. I wanted to finish the pages about the Mayan collapse before that, and I have been aware that the Mayan civilization collapsed and we're not really sure why because the sources are far in between. In the end, as I was reading the article for the second time, I realized that it did not say much. It basically said, well, it's a mystery and we don't know why it's a mystery, which was not really helpful because it was several pages long and it talked about Mayan history, but it did not answer the question that the article was touting, so I was a bit annoyed by that clickbait because it's fine if you don't know the answer, but why do you make a 6-page article saying that, well, we don't know, you know? So, okay. In my Commonplace book, I use two kinds of pens to write. I have a Muji gel pen in 0.5 in the color black and also in grey, and depending on my mood I might write mainly in grey or mainly in black. When I'm writing in grey I use the black color to underline or circle stuff and vice versa. I also choose usually another color to have different information to make the page more varied and more readable for me. I usually have some fine liners by Stabilo or Staedtler. They're quite cheap. I've had the Stabilo liners since I was in high school when we were doing a lot of maps in geography lessons, and I bought the Staedtlers at the discount store Action in France, but I've seen them in dollar stores here in Canada, so it's widely available and it's cheap, and I like the pop of color it gives to the page. I only use one special color on my pages to not make it too loud and tiring, but I like changing the colors depending on the different subjects because it's just fun for me to use a pretty pen. So every time I'm visiting a museum and I see a Mayan artifact or an Aztec artifact, I'm always taking a mental note saying that I want to learn more about those civilizations, I want to read a novel about it, I want to read their myths, and every time I don't go through with it, and it got so annoying to think about that, so that when I saw that article and I started my page, I was like, okay, now is the time to learn more about this, especially since the next issue of National Geographic I borrowed also had an article about the Inca civilization. So I was like, okay, all of Mesoamerica is telling me that I need to learn more about it. So I started taking notes from articles and from online publications. Obviously, if you're an expert in Mesoamerican history, you're gonna think that I'm simplifying things a lot and things are not exact, but that's okay, that's how you get to know a subject. I remember when I was at university and I was doing my master's on a painter for the Victorian period, I was at that point pretty familiar with the Victorian era. When I would read publications that would make shortcuts or not be exact, I would be annoyed, but that's okay. When I start working in my commonplace book, I usually don't start with a plan. I just have an article I want to talk about, or I saw a Google Doodle and I got interested, so I don't plan the pictures I want to glue. And when I'm writing, I don't want to stop and look up pictures, print them, cut them, and paste them in my notebook. So what I usually do is either leave space on the page and measure it, or I decide to not glue anything on the pages and print pictures that I will hole punch with my disc bound hole punch and then include in my pages. I like that way I have more space on my writing pages, and I've also recently decided to start writing at the back of those pictures. That way I can write where the picture was from, if there was a legend. So for example, that map of the Mayan cities was in the National Geographic, so I added what was written about it. I also decided to print my pictures on slightly thicker paper, and you can't really see it on screen, but the paper I'm writing on is very thin, maybe 110 grams, and I think the one I'm using to print the pictures is 180, so it's not too bulky, but it's more sturdy because sometimes the pictures are quite small, and I've realized that when a picture is that small and it has only like 3 or 4 hole punched into it, it's quite flimsy and I don't want them to get damaged, and I find that solution pretty nice. As I was reading that Inca article, I kept getting puzzled by the fact that they would talk about the Mayan Empire, the Mayan cities, and the Inca and the Aztec, and I could not really differentiate them. So I decided to do a timeline, and you might not have done timelines in school, but it's such a wonderful activity. Honestly, I like doing timelines and they're very good for my brain. I remember doing timelines when I was in middle school. I don't remember them from high school, but when I started university and I had those very complex civilization classes, I started doing timelines just to put things into perspective, to have the information in a different context than in my notes, because when you're doing a timeline, you have to reread your notes, which is good when you have to study for an exam. And you also look for more information. You rewrite information, which is good for memorization. And since then, I've been doing timelines a lot. So I decided that the best way to understand the link between Inca, Maya, Aztec was to make a timeline. And it was so helpful because even if the dates I chose were broader maybe that an expert would choose, they were really helpful for me to see that the Inca and the Maya weren't happening at the same time. The Mayan is a much more ancient civilization, and then I could see the link when there was colonization and how it affected different civilizations. What I started to do as I got to have more dates was to use my ruler to stagger them in the same way so that the 11th century in the Mayan timeline would be in the same place in the Inca timeline. And I knew this was just a quick way to do that timeline. I was going to do it in a pretty way later. In the end, I ended up doing a timeline with 4 tiers. The first one for the Mayan civilization, second the Inca civilization, third the Aztec civilization, and finally the Toltec civilization. And I used different colors to do them. When I decided to do them in a pretty way, I needed them to be small enough to fit in my commonplace book. So I decided to do them on Canva, use a small font and different colors, different shades of colors, as you can see. And I had measured the space I had for that timeline so that I could hole punch and then fold the page and that it would perfectly fit into my notebook, and I'm very proud of that timeline. Since then, I've read another article about, I think it was the Mayan civilization, and while I was reading, I was able to look at my timeline and see where all the stuff were happening, and things were much clearer, and I enjoyed that very much. As I had printed my timeline, I took the opportunity to print more pictures, either of stuff I had already done or things I wanted to talk about. For example, I printed this amazing picture from the 19th century of the Baalbek Temple in Lebanon, and it's just such a gorgeous picture. I would love to visit that temple. I also printed pictures for the first pages I did for that notebook, which was for the book collector Francis Wolferston from the 16th century, I think. And I also printed pictures for pages I haven't done on screen yet, but that I had already done in my notebook. When I edit a video, I try to make things more coherent, even if they don't end up being chronological. So if you see pages now that I haven't written down yet and that I will write down in the rest of the video, that's okay, it's fine. I wasn't sure how to organize my commonplace book because the first one I had was a bound notebook, so I couldn't really move pages. But what I really enjoy with this disc bound system is that I can move pages around, and I don't have the pages numbered anymore nor an index, because what I like is that if I do a page about Mayan history and 2 months later I do another one, I can put them together. And what I've started to do is doing a thematic and chronological organization. So I started with biographies and then they are in chronological order. Then I have more broad history, so I have the Mayan history that's first because it's the oldest, and then I have a page about a volcanic eruption in the 6th century, so that's next. I wanted to take a little break on taking notes about articles because it requires a lot of focus, and I still wanted to work in my commonplace book because once you start working in a commonplace book, it's hard to stop, right? It's just, sometimes I just need to write. Mindlessly write. Obviously, when you're taking notes on an article, you can't be mindless because you need to think about it. But what I did here was writing down quotes from different books I had read recently, and on the little post-it note, I was also writing down words I wasn't sure about. So I decided to write down those words as well. Now, I've had a vocabulary notebook for English and French words since I started university, and I'm at my 3rd vocabulary notebook at that point, but I had not brought my vocabulary notebook with me to Canada when I moved in April, so I decided to use my commonplace book for that. And I think the idea is fine, but now my parents visited me for Christmas and they brought me so many notebooks I had left at home. So now I have my proper vocabulary notebook, so I will be able to copy the words I had added to that page, and it's going to be great. What I do when I copy words is that I like to have the sentence from which the word is from, because sometimes the context really helps you to understand that meaning of the word, because sometimes a word has several completely different meanings, and then when you're looking it up, you're like, I'm sure that's not what they meant, but as you don't have the context anymore, you can't really look for it. I also like to write the etymology of a word or the first time it was known to have appeared in English, That's why I miss my subscription to the Oxford English Dictionary so much. I had a free subscription when I was at university, and it was the most fun thing to do, to go to the Oxford English Dictionary, to see the different times the word had been used through the ages and see the first occurrence, what it meant at the time. As you can see, I really like learning about words. What I also add is the pronunciation of words. I usually write it with a different color and I use the phonetic alphabet. I decided to talk about Urania by Lady Mary Roth. This is a novel from the 17th century, and I'm not sure where I heard about that novel. Maybe it was a Google Doodle, or I read it in an article and then saved the page about the novel. But what was very interesting is that it's a novel written by a woman in the 17th century, and that's not something you come up a lot upon. A lot of the novels written anonymously from that time must have been written by women, right? But when you have information about the novel, its reception, its author, you just need to jump on the chance. As I was writing about the novel, I got really interested in its author, Lady Mary Roth, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right, but that's okay. So once I was finished with the pages on the novel, I wanted to do a page on the author because her last name was ringing a bell, and in fact she's part of a family that was famous for its different authors. She was Mary Herbert's niece, who also was a very famous writer from the 16th century. As I was writing the page about Lady Mary, I started to read about the house she spent her childhood in London, Bayonet's Castle, and I got really interested into Bayonet's Castle, so I wanted to do a page about that. So I had to really focus to stay on track because that house sounded so interesting. I just love learning about history, about any kind of subject, going from the Mayan civilization to an English writer from the 17th century is just my idea of heaven, basically. Now, I decided to change subject completely. As I had been reading the Mayan collapse article, I learned about the volcanic winter of 536, and I had learned about the year without summer from the 18th century, I believe. I had heard a podcast about it from stuff you missed in history class, but I didn't know about the volcanic winter of 736. And I got very interested because I had the Mesoamerican side of the stories. I wanted to know the side of the story from the other side of the world. It was so interesting to see what the volcanic winter was caused by, because historians don't really know the specific or perfect chain of events. And what was most fascinating was to see the different ramification of that volcanic winter about food, about culture, to see the different way that different people experienced it, to see it appearing in writing in Constantinople, in Rome, in Lebanon. It was so very interesting, and I made a note to myself to learn more in depth about those ramifications, because at that point I was pretty tired and I wanted to change subjects, and also it was pretty late. So I basically have 3 jobs, right? And the only time I usually have to do my journaling and my commonplacing is at night, so that's why I'm using artificial lighting. And when you see a bit of footage that was filmed during the daytime, that was maybe a Sunday, and I took 2 hours to myself to just play in my journals. And here it is, this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I would love to see in the comments who among you came to that channel because of my previous commonplace book video. I was not expecting that video to be so successful on the scale of my channel. I had the footage for almost a year at that point, and I wasn't sure anyone would be interested because I had never done commonplace content on my channel, and I realized that the way commonplace was not exactly like the way I had been watching, so I wasn't sure it would be interesting to anyone. So I'm really grateful for the conversations we had in the comments, for the people who came to that channel. So what I would love would be for you to tell me in the comments if you came from that video and what you enjoyed about it, and if you have a commonplace book, what do you put in it? I would love to know. If you have any tidbits that you think I would love to put in my commonplace book, please don't hesitate. I love to learn stuff. I think life is so much more fun when you can learn about things, and we're in a period of history that we can learn about so many things, which can be intimidating and overwhelming, but at the same time, it's just so great. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!